Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Rivet, and I'm the founder of the Prolific Circle. To everyone tuning in tonight, we thank you for being here. While we all scattered across different screens right now, we're here for the same urgent reason, which is to figure out how to be in community during these uncertain times. This World AIDS Day finds us in a very tough position. Not only are those in power trying to cut the funding that keeps people alive, but they've also decided not even to acknowledge the day. And so when they choose to forget, we have to choose to remember and to act. And so that's what brings us here tonight to remember those we've lost, but also fight for those who are still here. And so, because this has never just been about HIV and AIDS, it's about healthcare, it's about housing, and it's about basic dignity. And I'm honestly in awe of the folks who will be joining us tonight for this conversation. They're not just experts in their fields, but they're also truth tellers, they are healers, they are survivors, and they've been in the trenches, in the labs, in the halls of power, fighting on our behalf. And they're here because they see what's happening and they don't want to be silent. And so I extend a huge thank you to each one of them for showing up. And I also want to say a quick shout out to the teams at AIDS United and at GLAD as well, who pulled this broadcast together. And also to our sponsors, Gilead Sciences, and to Moby, to Planned Parenthood of Greater New York, Forward Lounged, and to also you, our viewers who are watching this. You are part of this, your presence matters. And we're here because we want to push back by showing up, by listening, and by having each other's backs. It's plain and simple. And I don't want to take too much time, so I want to welcome our moderator tonight. His name is Bishore Jenkins. He's the current Senior Manager of Government Relations at AIDS United. Bishore, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and good evening, everyone. As Jonathan mentioned, I am the Senior Manager of Government Relations at AIDS United. I'm very pleased to be tonight's moderator, and I'm also a person living with HIV, and I am approaching nearly a decade of living with HIV. And I am very pleased to be joined by many colleagues and even friends on tonight's event. And we are all in for a treat tonight as we learn from their insights as we commemorate this World AIDS Day. So we are joined by Carl Bologna Jr., the CEO of AIDS United, Tori Cooper, the Director of Strategic Outreach and Training at the Human Rights Campaign, Dimitri Daskalakis, MD, former CDC official, and as of today, the incoming Chief Medical Director at Callen Lorde in New York City, Mandisa Moore O'Neill, the Executive Director of the Center for HIV Law and Policy, and Robert Suttle, the Chair of the Elizabeth Taylor AIDS Foundation Council of Justice Leaders, and a renowned national and international thought leader and expert on HIV criminalization. So I want to welcome each of you. But before we begin, I'd like to ground tonight's discussion of why tonight's conversation is so critical. Of course, we commemorate, we remember those lives that we lost to HIV. We remember those whose names we know well. The dazzling dancer, Alvin Ailey, the tenacious tennis talent, Arthur Ashe, the winsome writer, Joseph Beam, the racy yet real rapper, Eazy-E, the judicious journalist, Max Robinson, the quintessential quiet storm disc jockey, Melvin Lindsay, the seductive singer, Sylvester. But we also remember those names who never made headlines and whose diagnoses were rarely, if ever, spoken in life and in death. And we also recognize that the epidemic did not end with their untimely deaths. We know the staggering statistics. Black women remain 10 times more likely to be diagnosed with HIV than white women. Black gay men have a 1 in 2 lifetime vulnerability to HIV. We also know the context: a federal government not only derelict in its duty, but that is actively causing harm to communities most vulnerable to HIV, and federal proposals that threaten to undermine and destabilize the HIV safety net as we know it. So, as we remember and as we contend with the ongoing policy landscape in our communities, I want to offer three commitments to frame tonight's conversation. And like a good Baptist preacher, I have three considerations. This World AIDS Day, we must engage in reparative reflection, not a reflection that checks off a box, not the polite reflection that issues empty proclamations or press releases for all the perfunctory awareness days, but reflection and remembrance that ask, what needs repairing? Not tinkering around the edges repair work, but repairing that is accountable and makes whole those communities that have been harmed for generations. Reparative reflection about what systems and policies must be dismantled so that people living with and vulnerable to HIV have the care and dignity that we deserve. Secondly, we must move beyond performative awareness and a performative policy consensus in our public policy towards care that disrupts power and stigma. You know, the type of performative awareness that uses our community and our fight as pawns in State of the Union addresses, only to reverse course and attempt to defund EHE, or I mean the very program that they once championed. The type of performative awareness that is only concerned about the global pandemic of HIV, but has no regard or concept for the domestic epidemic and how our domestic and global efforts are inextricably linked. The type of performative awareness, even among HIV organizations who brand themselves as justice-centered organizations, only to marginalize people living with HIV, seeking care. Finally, we must remember the legatees, those of us who have inherited this rich legacy of HIV advocacy and who also find ourselves living with HIV in this era. Those of us who have inherited a powerful legacy from those who have come before us. Those folks who are aging with HIV, folks newly diagnosed with HIV. Those of us who have to go to the Black queer canon to commune with elders who never lived to see this day, but whose words sustain us still. Those who are navigating stigma in their families, in their workplaces, in their faith communities, and in their schools. Those who find themselves in small, intimate towns worried that their diagnosis will be found out by a friend or a trusted faith leader. Those who find themselves in big cities, but have yet to build community and are isolated, navigating HIV alone. So as we commemorate this World AIDS Day, we pledge to remember by engaging in reparative reflection, pushing ourselves and our leaders to abandon performative awareness and advocacy, and by remembering the legatees and those who have inherited a great legacy to end HIV stigma and the HIV epidemic. So with that in mind, we are going to start off with our first question, which will be posed to all of our panelists. And feel free to jump in, whoever's feeling so inclined. There's a famous quote that says that our lives begin to end the day that we are silent about the things that matter. In fact, that person that penned those words also said that there comes a time when silence is betrayal. Of course, we know that that was the famed Baptist preacher, Martin Luther King, Jr. So as we start tonight's conversation, what moral challenge do our leaders in our community desperately need to hear tonight as we commemorate World AIDS Day in the context of Trump 2.0? So whoever wants to start us off, just jump right in.
So I'm happy to start off. Good evening, Bashar. Good evening, my co-panelists. Good evening, folks who are here. We made it, y'all. So the first thing, if I could have the microphone and they couldn't talk and could only hear, I would remind them that this will exist for people other than white men. There there seems to be this when we hear anti-DEI from white men, they're saying they don't want anybody but white men. When we're seeing diversity, equity, inclusion, which are three of the greatest words in the English language, they're saying they don't want anybody that's diverse other than other white men. They don't want anything to be equitable, and they certainly. And so I think about all of that. And so I wish I could say to that. And when it comes to HIV in particular, I think it's imperative that we remember. So yes, Black people are going to be incredibly impacted, more so than anybody else. Yes, trans people will be impacted, more so than other communities of people, in part because we already have less than every other community. And white men are going to suffer too. And so the world exists outside of this bubble that is Washington, D.C. right now, and where you have to make over a certain amount of money to be considered a human, and you have to have been born in the United States to be considered an American, and you have to have lived a life and married. If you're a man, then you have to have married a woman, and if you're a woman, you have to have married a man to be considered a real person. And so I just want to remind people the world exists, and there are people other than white, cisgender, heterosexual men. It's actually not the majority of us. That was it.
I was going to add, I feel like you introduced me as a white cisgender male. So so I thought I would add, I think one of the things, having been on the inside of the federal government very recently, having recently resigned, I just want to back up with a lot of strength what Tori says. There is purposeful work happening to confuse health equity, which is what we all do every day, for DEI. And DEI is all diversity, equity, inclusion. These are all amazing words. They're all really important. And it's the reason why our workforce in HIV and in public health look more like the communities we serve. So let's first start that there's nothing that DEIA work is good work, sort of in the HR space. But what is also happening is that there's this purposeful confounding of trying to sort of make health equity somehow be in that buzzword. And that is giving sort of people the ability to say that health equity stuff that you're doing in HIV or anywhere, that stuff is just DEAI stuff. And so it's really, I think, important that we say out loud, we think DEIA is really important, right? I think it sort of molds the way that workforces look, but then also to say, hey, you guys, that health equity has nothing to do with that. That's not about a strategy for how to hire people that are more diverse, which is good. It in fact is the thing that we need to do to make sure that the entire nation and the world is healthy. It has nothing to do with that sort of catchphrase, and really try to differentiate, in fact, that it's different. Because I think, ripping off Tori, I think it's true. It is a device trying to make this a very homogenous white world that ultimately will result in this country not being a good place.
Carl Bologna, AIDS United. I like to call a thing, right? I think we're talking about the America First policy. And so for me tonight, I think that the moral challenge is really simple but profound, is we can't normalize abandoning people, right? In this moment when whole communities are being written out of budgets, erased from the rhetoric and how we even talk about society and public life, silence isn't neutrality, it's complicity. And I think, this movement, this HIV movement, has never survived on silence. Every bit of progress that we have earned has come from everyday people insisting on the basic truth that our lives are worth investing in. And I know that's true for this community. For me, the challenge to leaders is to tell the truth about who is being harmed and act like their lives matter. And to our community to remember that we have faced hostile governments before, and that every time we organized, we cared for one another, and we built power anyway. And I think that's still possible. I think that the contrast to America First policy is, a quote, I think it's John F. Kennedy, right? A rising tide lifts all boats. We cannot cut, slash, and burn our way out of a bad economic situation. We have to treat the least of us well, and all of us can prosper.
I'm so excited to be in this conversation with the very folks who are here, some of whom I've known for a very long time, and somehow like we're just being in a plenary together. I love this idea of a moral challenge. And sometimes it takes me a while to think of what to say. And instantly I was like, the moral challenge of every leader, including myself, is to holistically and emphatically decenter whiteness. And I want to be clear, like when I say whiteness, I don't just mean white people, because how white supremacy is structured, and to be very clear, anything that's based in the US is founded in this idea of white supremacy, because that's how this country was founded. Everything about that has not only to do with just white people, but we can all internalize and manifest that. What does that look like? In the HIV world, how it looks is this idea that we have to whisper words like sex work, or we have to whisper words like injection drug use, or like things that fit outside this idea of what heteronormativity tells me is acceptable, right? So like I can't have an honest conversation about HIV because those people might not respect us. And I think, again, thinking of silence and how Audre Lorde, my Lord, has always told us our silence will never protect us. You know, as she said, like, the machine will grind you to pieces, whether or not it is true that you speak. And that always stuck with me because it's such a stark image. And it reminds me of this moment in which I don't often think people are saying intentionally, oh, I'm centering whiteness. How it often comes out is, oh, let's play it safe, right? Let's be strategic about who we engage in this policy initiative, right? Or let's be cautious of saying the word Black too many times, or brown, or immigrant, or all these words like that we know mean our people. And it often looks like not being honest about the ways in which we've all internalized these messages, and therefore have a duty to consistently work to decentralize and to externalize the things that we've internalized. And so like the moral challenge of my fellow leaders is to make it a constant political practice and to be bold about it, right? If we're in this moment in which we see what our communities are having to go through just to access basic human services, right? Like it's becoming harder to get access to food, access to healthcare, housing, dignity, things that for me are the basis of humanity. We as leaders have to mimic and actually exceed that boldness that we're expecting folks on the ground to do. So to me, that's a part of the moral challenge of this moment. And I'm excited for us to actually sit in that and to continue to manifest that.
And for me, I will just echo, I think Carl touched on it about truth telling, and Mendisa's, talking about the point Mandisa just made. I'm sorry, I just slipped my mind because it's 2 points that I wanted to touch on. But, the importance of just acknowledging what's really happening and finally just telling the truth about it. And that is something that I have realized that my purpose here is to really, tell the truth about the systems that exist. And it's just a wonder if people are, really paying attention to what's really going on. And I think for a while we've had it quite good in this country in a way that, people can do the things that they want to do or be who they want to be. But yet now that things have changed, I think people are still trying to continue in that and not necessarily acknowledge what is really going on. And I think the Times is really showing us that, especially in the areas in which we're working in and with all that's happened in terms of cuttings and like issues around immigration and who's bad and who are criminals and obviously what Tori touched on, like who is worthy of being in this country and having jobs and things like that. I think it's time that we get face reality, right? Really get serious, looking at ourselves in the mirror and saying, you know, who am I? Where do I stand with what's going on? And I think with what's happening now is sort of showing us who we are and where we stand. So if you thought that you had it going on or whatever, you might not be feeling like you got it going on because the powers that be are showing us otherwise. So I feel like it's time for us to really get serious, face the truth about what's going on in this country and who's benefiting and who's not, and also getting serious about where do we stand in the midst of all of this.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of those answers. And I think that's really a perfect segue into our next question. Mandisa, you sort of lifted up the decentering of whiteness and how whiteness operates globally. And I think we're seeing the impact of that in the attacks on the PEPFAR program as well. Of course, we know that PEPFAR is the program that has literally saved 26 million people globally from what would have been certain death otherwise. And so I'm wondering if one of you or maybe two of you wants to chime in and really speak to why this program is so critical to our global efforts to end the epidemic, and how can we combat the complacency that exists, but also complacency, to your point, Mandisa, that's steeped in a privileging of the United States over and above, you know, people that live across the globe that are impacted by HIV.
I'm happy to chime in. I think for me, one of the most amazing things about PEPFAR, it's not just, I really focus, much of my career has been around on the Congress, right? And PEPFAR is not just a global health program. It is literally the most successful bipartisan public health effort in modern history. You mentioned it, Bashar, 26 million lives have been saved. That's not an abstraction. That's literally an archive of like parents that still got to raise their children and communities that are still intact and nations functioning health systems. And so, you know, as we talk about white supremacy and the true goals of our current government, you know, PEPFAR most greatly impacts the African continent and Black people. And it's no mistake that that was one of the first things that were targeted. And cutting PEPFAR, it's not fiscal responsibility. It's frankly a fiscal and moral, it's negligence. You know, withdrawing from PEPFAR, it's not just lost lives. You know, they destabilize health systems. They're weakening economies on the African continent, and it's going to take decades to rebuild that infrastructure. It's completely devastating, and we have to find a way to hold them accountable. That's not just a global issue. That's a domestic issue. That's a moral issue.
I feel like I'm just going to back up Carl too and say, you know, something's gone wrong with the country, right? There's something wrong with the US right now. And that is that somehow it is acceptable to say that we have no role in supporting the health of the globe. And that is a departure from, you know, really decades and decades and decades of leadership that has really made the US a key partner to so many countries. And, you know, I think there are more examples than PEPFAR, but PEPFAR is probably the best, where you know, the notion that that our aid is something that only benefits the people that we're serving, like is inaccurate, because the health of the globe is the health of the US. And so I think that, I got to work outside of the HIV space in global health, where I was doing work in influenza and COVID and all of these other scary respiratory infections. And, I think that the part that's shocking is that, the reason that we're leaders or were leaders in global health in the world is because we had altruism, and that we brought something to the table as opposed to just taking. And so I think that, and our historically with PEPFAR, and I'd love to see what everyone else thought, that wasn't like a transaction, right? It wasn't like, we'll trade you HIV meds if you give us something back. It was actually really good health diplomacy. It was really good, like, building relationships. And, having, again, been working in the global health space a bit, like, those relationships are dissolving. And, I think that one of the things that's scary is that this administration, the same way that they're sort of saying that, we can't, support DEIA, we can't support gender ideology, whatever that means, since gender is not an ideology, but just like a part of natural human experience. Like, they're trying to spread that outside of our country, and also say that other countries can't do that if they want to still take part in like aid and support that we're giving. And I'm just going to sort of conjure the word that Carl did. It is immoral to do that. And I think that the more we say, like, A, it's not normal, and B, it is immoral, like, we do have a responsibility to the globe because of our scientific expertise and, frankly, like, sort of where we are from the perspective of finances and resources. So you can't let the US cannot exist if the rest of the globe falls apart. It's not how it goes. And so I just echo that, the real thing for me is, it is immoral that we're not supporting the health of people around the globe, because it is our responsibility as the global leader.
I looked up the word united on dictionary.com, because I think what we're talking about, first of all, I didn't know I was off mute. That's and united, dictionary.com says united means joined together politically for a common purpose or by common feelings. And what I am reminded of daily, almost by the hour, from this administration is that here in the United States, we're everything but that now. We have the folks at the very top who are doing things every single day to further divide us, to further separate and create these levels of privilege, that to make it even more pronounced, the folks who have and the folks who have not, in terms of healthcare, in terms of resources, in terms of education, in terms of housing, and the list could go on and on. And it is, and when we think about this really, I really want to say white nationalists, but I don't want people to confuse that with the KKK, because they suck too. But this nationalist movement that is very white, heterosexual, male, patriarchal centered, that really excludes most of the people in the country and even more people in the world. This is everything but united. It is all about division. And it is about the division that keeps people from ever achieving more and getting to the level financially and resource-wise that they're at. And I think that's all very, very intentional. The fact that we have a federal government that's saying, don't go to college. College is a waste of your time. That nursing isn't a real profession.
I mean, the reason that I love Tori is because Tori doesn't have to take the gloves off. The gloves are always off, because I've learned from Tori in my career and my experience, as well as from Carl and Bashar and Robert and Mandisa, that you got to call it as it is. And so, when I resigned, I said, all of this is eugenics, right? There is this desire to sort of, and I meant it. I didn't stutter when I typed it. Or when I've said it, because there's a desire to have this, like, that only the strong survive and only the favorable strong survive, right? The reason that there's an attack on health equity is because health equity is what, like, lets people achieve the best health that they can, right? And the mission is not that. The mission is to break the system so people who can't afford health, who can't afford to be well, are actually then driven to a place where they're so sick that they're not going to, do well. And I think, again, it's you got to call it as you see them. So when you say, let's not vaccinate kids, if they get the infection and they survive, that's going to make them stronger. Like, that's eugenics. And so that is the same that we're seeing with transgender folks. It's the same that we're seeing with like the DEI confusion with health equity that I talked about. It is literally like when you saw that we're not going to acknowledge World AIDS Day and you're going to pull PEPFAR apart and stop HIV prevention, take parts of Ryan White apart, eugenics. Got to call them as they are. And so like it is a dire situation and really requires as much bravery and courage as we can muster to fight.
Also want to complicate like this idea like of the US as a global leader in terms of oftentimes or sometimes in this conversation, we can talk about it like what is happening in the US is new, right? When in actuality, like we've actually been a global leader in eugenics, right? So if we look at Nazi Germany, it is well documented that they based their entire eugenics strategy on Jim Crow here in the US. And like it's documented. And in fact, at certain points, they said they took it too far in the US. We can't go that far here in Germany. So it's important like that we name our history of eugenics, of ugly laws that date back to the 19th century and before that did what is now happening on a new scale times 10, right? Because if not, like, and it's important to like name that history, because if not, again, we can be ahistorical. Who does that center? Right? Who's privileged if we don't talk about how the U.S. has actually been a eugenics experiment? And I'm saying that not to be discouraging, but instead like to put us in alignment with the millions of people who fought and resisted this experiment and have fought for us to exist and continue that fight. But it's really important like that we note the ways that, like, again, what's happening is clearly on another scale than say 2 years ago, 5 years ago. I don't want to invisibilize that. And it's a part of a legacy that has gotten us here. And part of how we got here is this idea of a us and them, right? You know what I mean? So maybe I don't like that immigrants or trans folks are being targeted, but all the time that us cis people spend having these weird conversations about not understanding trans identity, right? All this time that like folks spent talking about undocumented versus documented immigrants, a part of that is how we get here, right? Because it grew this idea that othering is normative. All the time that people like me who are not living with HIV center ourselves in conversations and not people with HIV, it has contributed. And I say this again because if we've done it, we can still stop doing it. Like we can always intervene and do something else. But to me, it's just really important as we talk about like the US as a global leader to talk about our history and exactly what we've led in. You know what I mean? Like, for example, it's important to know like that PEPFAR falls under the Department of State. That's not that's intentional.
Yeah, thank you so much for just that rich conversation there. So much has already been lifted that references our next question. And so given the reality that it's clear that these people don't give a damn about us, what steps should we as public health advocates be taking individually and collective to counter, this anti-science, anti-evidence, anti-Black, anti-queer, anti-trans effort, and how that impacts our public health efforts. Dr. Daskalakis, I think you'd be perfect to sort of start us off with this one, just given given your recent ongoing efforts at the CDC and you leaving the CDC.
Yeah, no, I think that it's the question of the hour, which is, what do you do when the political will is really aiming to destroy the public's health, right? And so that's, I think, where we are right now, where you have sort of this, irresistible force, which is the political will that's pushing up against what we thought was like our immovable object of community and science. And it seems as if it's able to push that immovable object, and maybe it's not as immovable as we thought, which is, very scary. But I think that's the reality. So I think, the first is, self-care is really important. And Mandisa, I'm gonna sort of use that Audre Lorde quote as well, that it is like really, political resistance, self-care. So the next thing I'm going to say has to be tempered by self-care, which is that it's really important to speak out and to sort of call it as it is. But I understand that it doesn't feel safe to do it. I mean, I can vouch for that in droves, how unsafe it feels to speak out. But where you can, it's important. Where you can steady the ship, I think it's also really important. So I think that's, I think that as we're seeing choppy waters and we have people who are leaders in organizations, so much of what they're doing is not doing the good thing, but just trying to tread water and not let the ship sink. And so I think that every opportunity that we can get to do the good thing, we should, but then also realize that in public health right now, and I take that broadly, we really need to make sure that we steady the ship as much as we can. And then this is the controversial thing I'm going to say, which is, not that other things that I've said or have not been controversial so far, but what I was going to say is that I believe that really we shouldn't be looking to try to repair the broken things that are getting broken more. I have an analogy, which is, that there was this golden age of public health, right? Where we had like built this temple, and it was this temple, which and certainly was not perfect in any way, but it was better than what we've got right now. So like we were able to sort of bring HIV diagnoses down, get more people virally suppressed, get rid of measles deaths in the US. We have a long list. But things that happened during COVID, things that happened during other parts of our era started to create cracks in the foundation of that. And sort of that temple, those cracks allowed, people to infiltrate, to actually bring it into ruins. So where we are today is that so much of the institutions that we think about, like HHS, like CDC, those are at this point damaged beyond repair. And so I think that the call to action, in my opinion, is rather than try to rebuild the old thing, we need to really focus our energy on steadying the ship today and building the new thing. Because the thing that you do today, even if it's not great, even if it's not funded appropriately, even if it's like imperfect, that is going to be the blueprint for what the future is going to be when the pendulum swings and this insanity is over. And so like my analogy, which I started and then completely abandoned, was like in the classical period, you can build a temple, you have the Acropolis, and the Acropolis is in ruins. You are now in a dark age, and the dark age, like Mandisa, I don't want to sound like doom and gloom. We are not even close to out of it. We're going to be in the dark age for a while. But then when you're done with the dark age, you have a renaissance. In the Renaissance, you don't go back to fix that temple. You don't go back to the pyramids and try to make them perfect again. You build a Sistine Chapel. You build the next thing. And so that's my call to action, I think, to folks in public health, which is like, don't lament the things that are being destroyed because the political will is to destroy them. Focus more on what the future state is going to be, because that's going to be the real future. These old agencies, these old legacy things, they're not going to be the future.
With that sort of theme in mind, sort of keeping in mind that we have our own agency and capacities as a community, recently we have seen a powerful but striking juxtaposition in our movement with Black leaders taking the helm at HIV organizations across the country. including one of whom is joining us tonight, Carl Bologna, who is the new CEO of AIDS United. And of course, Mandisa Moore-O'Neill, who leads CHLP as a Black feminist advocate. And yet at the same time, we are witnessing a major, and that's really a understatement, racial backlash with anti-Blackness really everywhere, in every policy debate, literally coming from the mouth of our president on a daily basis almost. And we're also seeing the real life impacts of policy violence that would impact Black folks disproportionately. In addition to HR1, which would decimate health access for 40%, for the 40% of people with HIV who are Medicaid beneficiaries. And given this reality, given this duality of so many Black leaders sort of coming to the fore within the HIV movement at the same time of this anti-Black policy environment that we're in, how can and should Black advocates and leaders of organizations mobilize together and support advocates, support people living with HIV, work alongside people living with HIV to combat this policy violence that is clearly aimed at harming Black people?
Mandisa, I'm happy to go first if it makes sense. And I'm thinking a couple of questions back to, it's funny that we're talking about Blackness and the comment that Dr. Daskalakis mentioned about eugenics. You know, I think we're living in a complete contradiction right now, right? There's powerful Black leadership in our movement and escalating anti-Black policy violence targeting the communities we serve. It's not a coincidence, it's a backlash. I feel like, you know, we're Icarus. We flew too close to the sun. We had a Black president and we had all of this hope and it was too much. And, you know, I think for Black leaders, the work right now is probably twofold. We have to strengthen our infrastructure together, not in isolation. We need strategies that are shared tables, rapid response coordination, and a commitment to protect Black-led organizations that are consistently underfunded, but do the heaviest lifting. I think the call for the moment is also that, you know, HR1, it wasn't just a budget bill, to Dr. Daskalakis' point, it was a blueprint for shrinking the Black life expectancy. You know, cuts to community organizations aren't bookkeeping. They really are a deliberate set of attacks on ecosystems that support Black queer people, Black gay, Black men, Black LGBTQ folks, Black trans women, Black people living with HIV, and rural Blacks even. And so I think, you know, organizations, if you're on this call, I think we can combat this if we, you know, embed racial justice into our policy agendas, of course. Invest real money into Black-led work. We have to build cross-movement solidarity with repro justice, with democracy protection. That's going to be key. Immigrant rights and economic justice. And we have to refuse to silo HIV from the larger fight against state violence, right? You know, I think the path forward is just, it's coalitional, it's unapologetically Black, and it's grounded in a long-term strategy, not just this crisis reaction, because that's what they want, right? We've seen things come out at a rocket pace so that we're just constantly reacting, but we have to be strategic and we have to be planful.
Yeah, thank you for that, Carl. You used one of my favorite words, state violence, which I think is just super critical to actually understanding what the political moment is. And I think it's also important for bold Black leaders. I'm not talking about the conservative ones who are white adjacent, because how often have we seen those in power find the most complacent and respectable Black person or immigrant or trans person who we know is doing things in their own interest and not in the interest of the people to put. So I agree, and I want to see more bold Black leadership like you and me and Robert and Tori and Bashar and everyone else who I didn't name, on this call. Folks who aren't afraid to question and to challenge. But all of that to say, I'm really interested in the political necessity of the big of the Big Tent. I think that is what's so challenging about engaging in social change work through a nonprofit lens, is that sometimes it encourages this silo mindset, right? Of how do I get funding for this? And how do I get funding for HIV and for gender and for all of this? And to be gender justice work is HIV work. Racial justice work is HIV, like all of these things. How do we embody that in terms of, like you said, how do we ensure that we're part of the Medicaid fights, knowing how people with HIV are directly impacted by any cut as far as to Medicaid? How do we ensure that when people work to distract us, on these conversations about women in sports and bathrooms, that we're ready to recenter the conversation, and move it from these red herrings and move it to, let's talk about safety. Yeah, you care about safety? Let's talk about why it's more cops than schools and neighborhoods. There's more cops than food banks, if you want to talk about safety. So how are we also engaging in a constant practice of political education to critically understand the moment and not just think, it's too hard for people to get? We have to understand how power is arranged. Oftentimes, I'm in spaces in which folks say words like radical or revolutionary, and they're not talking about what we're seeing right now. We are witnessing a revolution. The only difference is it's not the ones that maybe many of us envisioned. What they've been able to do in under a year is nothing short of revolutionary. It's just that it's going in the wrong direction. It's not what maybe some of us thought it would look like. Mm-hmm. But if we're not clear as to what's happening in this moment, then we will continue to, like you said, be in this place of responding and never actually able to build the institutions that we know are going to get us through this. Again, I'm not saying spend all of our time studying, but how do we incorporate an intentional practice to understand what is actually happening? So for example, how is it clear, when this happens, we can use cute words and also be clear, this is eugenics.
I'm sorry to take up so much space, but thank you, Mandisa. I learned something earlier when you were saying that, I'm not surprised, but when you were saying that Jim Crow was a kind of a blueprint for folks in Nazi Germany. And, I think about, in the eugenics piece, I think about the only reason the United States doesn't have universal healthcare is because of Black people, because they thought that we would die off in 3 generations if we didn't have access to healthcare. So they formed systems that impact everyone in order to erase us. So again, let's call a thing a thing.
While you were talking, Mandisa, the word diabolical came to mind. Diabolical. And what's the root of that word? Diablo, which is Spanish for the devil himself. That came to my mind while you were talking. It is absolutely diabolical. What they have done and what they plan on doing. It's absolutely diabolical. And I keep mispronouncing the word, but history will not be kind. History will not be kind to this moment in time.
So that in mind, I sort of want to pivot and ask if those of us on the call that would like to share, just sort of lift up who you're remembering today in the spirit of memory and remembrance, understanding that this isn't the first diabolical regime that we've navigated, and are those that have inspired us have also lived under diabolical regimes. And so I'm wondering if you can lift up who you're inspired by, who you're remembering today in a spirit of remembrance as we continue to wage our current fight against HIV.
I can keep jumping in. We are, I think, almost a year and almost a month from the passing of Cornelius Baker, who reminds me that, our dignity has to always be non-negotiable. His leadership taught us, that expertise and compassion are not separate skill sets. Our movement has to have both, especially right now. We have to educate ourselves and we have to have passion. And then I think I'm holding the memory of so many people that I don't know, that I haven't met, that came before me, folks that were caregivers early on in the fight against AIDS, organizers, outreach workers, who really just kept people alive when our government refused to, because we're kind of back at that place, right? I think they taught us that liberation isn't abstract. We have to make daily choices and acts of resistance, and again, continue to tell the truth.
I was thinking of one of my patients, actually, when I was a med student in 1997, 8. So antiretroviral therapy was around, but it was, not shockingly, not around for everyone. And so I remember working on the wards at Bellevue, and having my first transgender woman that I took care of, who was really angry. And the nurses were like, "Why is she so angry?" And I thought about her a lot on World AIDS Day, because of what the administration did and why it made me so angry. And it reminded me of what she said, which is that no one listens to me. And I remember sitting in the room and talking to her as a young med student, and her telling me the story of how the people who brought food wouldn't even bring the tray in for her, and would just leave it on the floor and not care, and how she would ask for things and people would ignore her. And that, that she even felt that she was put on respiratory isolation in a room by herself, so that no one would bother with her. And so I actually didn't think about anyone famous. I didn't think of any of my friends who passed away. I mean, I did, but the person who I thought about the most was that one transgender woman who taught me how important it is to be listened to, and how that is really what, we're gathered here for a World AIDS Day related event, but how, when you're not listened to, if we use that moniker that silence is equal to death, then our voices are life. And so if our voices aren't listened to, all we have is pretty bleak. And so I thought of her. I can't say her name, though I know her name, because it's not fair to say her name, but that was who I thought about on World AIDS Day. Very, very personal and specific.
I would say, for me, I don't have a particular name in mind, but I will say I think about the people who've come before me, those who fought in the early days of the epidemic. I was just a baby when this was happening. So, thank God for their efforts, in whatever way any community or individuals played in making sure that we would be alive today and have the treatment and hopefully the access that we have, so that we could live to see this day. And we've lived long enough to see what's happening now. And so I think, for me, I recognize what my purpose is as a person living with HIV. I think about the lineage, the queer lineage, the Black lineage, and understanding what my purpose is in this day and time. I talk about HIV criminalization, which is something that is intentional, something that, again, was initiated at the time when I was born. So I think, like, wow, who would have thought 40 some years later in my life that we would be faced with something like this. And so I take this time, I take what we do, I take these issues very seriously, and recognizing the importance and the responsibility that I have to do what I am supposed to do in this day and time, and not sit on my hands and not sit back and watch other people fight for me. I'm recognizing that I also need to stand and fight for myself, and also fight alongside other people who look like me and other people who are impacted that don't look like me, and how we need to work together and fight together. And so I feel like this time shows us what we need to do. And so it's just a matter of us really paying attention and taking it seriously, and really feeling compelled to do what needs to be done.
I think of two advocates. One is someone who I'm not even sure if advocate is language like that she would have used to describe herself. Is my Aunt Barbara. She died when I was 4, so in 89. And I think about how so much of the short time that she was living with HIV dealt with so much erasure and invisibilization of her life as a Black woman. And even though like she had all of the symptoms and all of the things that even, in the late 80s, folks knew, like to look for, because she was a Black woman, they refused to see that she could also be somebody who had this thing like that we thought was only for a certain sort of demographic. And how that's not that different than 2025. Honestly, in so many ways, in the ways that like so much of our narratives still don't center women, especially Black women, cis and trans. And I think about what she taught 4-year-old me, 40-year-old me now, in terms of discomfort, and how she was like, I'm not comfortable and I'm going to say something about it. And, I was a kid, so it didn't have the same sort of meaning it does now. But that's part of how I show up the way I am now, is because I saw very early the importance of speaking out, and how your personal situation can be a catalyst for collective liberation and strategy. And I think about her like how, okay, like, am I going to be like somebody said this racist thing in this meeting, as people often do. Am I going to just be uncomfortable? Am I going to say that was racist? You know what I mean? And how that has guided me, even ways that it has isolated me, because who wants to be around the girl who calls out the BS? I also think of Brian C. Jones very often. And oftentimes, like, with Brian, like, folks focus on his outspokenness or maybe his loudness or how he said the thing. And the first time I met him, it was so clear to me the way he loved his people, and that all of his outspokenness, all of his ire, if you could call it that, came from a deep love and passion for his people and for wanting us to be free. And I love how he never lost that. That's what anchored him, and is the reason why he was so bold and outspoken.
So I'll name someone that you all don't know, and his name is Aubrey Jefferson. Aubrey Lamont Jefferson, to be more exact. Aubrey we met in around 1981 when I was like 11, and a baby queen then, and Aubrey was a little baby sissy then, and he grew up into a big pump and was the most lovable person that you could ever meet. And Aubrey was diagnosed with HIV in 1994 and was dead by 1995. And The reason why I always mention Aubrey is because he died so young. And if he had lived one more year, if medical racism didn't exist and he had gotten a hold of these magic pills, what did Jack and the Beanstalk, those beans, 1 year before, like some folks did in San Francisco and maybe a few folks did in New York, who were all white, then he might still be here alive today talking trash, and I think of every person who died in 95. They were right there on the cusp of highly active antiretroviral therapy. And now we're talking about injectables, and we're talking about one shot for some people every other month, or one shot, 2 shots a year. And that was just unimaginable. And so I think of Aubrey a lot, especially around the holidays, and particularly when I think about what we're experiencing now as a community of people and workers and advocates, and the stuff that we're facing from the federal government. I think of See Every Coop. That they sent a mailer to every household in the United States to explain to people what HIV was and what it wasn't, how you got it and how you didn't get it, and how revolutionary that was at the time, and really still is. And that came from the top down. And now all we're getting from the top down is poop and misinformation and disinformation and hatred for people who are on this call, people who live in this country, who live and look, because everybody that looks like us doesn't live like us, but people who live and look like those of us who are on this call.
So given what you just sort of shared, Tori, the context that we're in right now, what does joy look like right now? Because I like to always remind myself that many of us live sort of in this dialectical tension. We're living in the midst of both joy and pain. To sort of reference Frankie Beverly and Maze a little bit. And yeah, so I'm wondering, we've talked a lot about sort of the context that we're in: anti-Blackness, anti-queerness, anti-trans attitudes, anti-immigrant, anti-evidence. What does joy look like now? What can joy look like in these times when we're literally combating so many different things that they're throwing at us? And how can joy be a praxis for resistance?
Well, I think, first of all, it is imperative that each person finds something that brings them joy, that you have to be radical and intentional about finding joy, hopefully every day, and in all kinds of situations, regardless as to what's happening outside of your door, regardless as to what's happening at your place of business if you work, regardless as to what's happening at the place where you get healthcare or that you used to get healthcare. You have to be intentional about finding joy. And for some people, that might be in a blunt. For some people, that might be in having sex with somebody else. For some people, it might just be listening to a song that was recorded perhaps even before they were born or before they had become the person that they are today. But whatever it is, for some of us, it's just sitting down drinking ice water. I love ice water, like cold ice water in a glass, because it takes me somewhere. It takes me back to my grandmother when we used to actually use glasses in the house. And so being intentional about finding something that brings you happiness, that takes you away from every single thing that exists in the world, even for just a moment, and then repeat it and use it as often as you need it. And then be intentional about finding something else that brings you some kind of joy as well.
what I love about this question, and I really appreciate like the care of all these questions, is to me it's it's a way to reclaim so much of how Black joy in this political moment has become this form of propaganda that I've seen, right? Where like, you know, this phrase that's actually rooted in Black feminism, if we're going to be 100, somehow, especially post-election, has become this way of trying to convince Black folks to opt out of organizing against this administration, right? Of I've done my part, now I get to sit in joy and watch everyone else do X, Y, and Z, as if the lineage that ever said that voting was a right, ever said that's all that you do is you vote and then you go home and you go to brunch. You know, but like, that was never the case. And I think about who benefits from a massive reframing of joy in this way that takes us out of the political legacy that is actually our birthright. So I appreciate this question because to me it's a chance to reclaim it in the Black feminist lineage that it belongs in, which is one where joy and rest are these things that we do to sustain us as we engage in advocacy, as we engage in organizing, right? It's never the end all be all, but it's a tool to keep us on the front, you know, like to keep us there. So for example, I don't hide the fact that I have a lot of warrior energy. You know, I don't hide the fact that I have a machete and I use it very often. I keep it sharp too, well oiled. And anyone who has done any kind of study around battle, around war, knows that no warrior is effective if they're on the battlefield 24/7. So for me, joy is a part of a political practice of being able to sustain myself in this battle because I'm very clear that we are in a marathon and that this is not a sprint. And so again, I guess love the question and a chance to talk about joy, to me, like to bring it back to its Black feminist roots and take it from the right that it, in my assessment, is very skillful at using our language in ways that actually prop up their narratives and benefit them.
Carl, it looked like you were going to jump in.
I guess I was thinking, I really appreciate what Mandisa said. It really resonated with me. And I was also thinking about the way the MAGA right has depicted Black communities. You know, we come from we're originated from shithole countries, and we come from dangerous, deadly neighborhoods, and they talk as if we have no joy. And, you know, I think the entire context of Black people in this country has been rooted in struggle, but we've always been a joyful people, you know, and it has been a tool of resistance for us because it keeps us in touch with our humanity. And I think it grounds us in the reasons that we actually fight back. I really appreciated the context about, you know, gonna sit this one out. That was a really popular thread about 10, 11 months ago. Not our fight. I'm convinced Russian bots are behind that half the time, right? It's our fight. And we have to fight for joy. You know, and I guess for the personal, for me, you know, it's like my kids laughing in the morning. It's not being weighed down by all of this. We live this all the time, but we are more than this, and we'll be past this moment as well.
I'm going to add, this is what right now brings me joy, because this is the kryptonite of the people that we're trying to fight, like having real conversations. So I just want to say that, you know, I think, you know, I am so happy to be here as like someone who I think sort of knows like what sort of my joy in my sort of universe, like, I sort of spending time with my family doing like things that refer to like my ethnicity, my Greek heritage, and like all of that, and realizing that that otherness makes them crazy, meaning it's literally the thing that is their kryptonite. And so like the fact that we're talking about joy, even when there's all this like craziness going on, this is the thing that that I think is just so hard for them to deal with or acknowledge. And so I get joy at the notion of actually providing them the kryptonite and sort of being joyful and having sort of the moments of clarity and happiness with my family and with my friends, that make them, frankly, run away. And they should run away, because our joy, and I think, Mandisa, you like referenced the exact quote that I was thinking about from Audre Lorde about like sustaining yourself as like like critical resistance. Like, this is the thing that they can't take. And so I get joy in sort of ways that we sustain ourselves. And that, and like I'll look at my friend Tori and say, that can be dancing to house music, Tori. It can be, right, you're welcome. It can be, going to dinner and having like the best Thai food in Brooklyn, which I'm going to have tonight with my friends since I'm here. That's the kind of thing that I think sustains me and frankly is an act of defiance. So thank you.
So I'm going to launch us into our last question for tonight. One of my sort of biggest inspirations is Essex Hemphill. And Essex Hemphill, of course, passed away 30 years ago now, in November of 1995. And one of his poems has a beautiful, powerful question that he raised. How can we share the future if we can't be instructed by our grief? And so for our last question tonight, before we launch into the questions that the audience will share, is what lessons from our long fight to end the HIV epidemic can prove most instructive as we create a world where people with HIV can live and thrive?
I feel like, at its core, Essex Hemphill teaches us that our grief it's a data point, right? It's information that tells us what we've loved, what we've lost, and what our obligations are. I think in this epidemic, it reminds us that the fight to end HIV has always been about people. It's not about programs or organizations or budget lines or politics. I think if we allow our grief to harden and like weigh us down in despair, it can be, it's not productive, but we can harden it into clarity and resolve and let it, kind of guide us in where we go and push us toward, creating a world where people with HIV don't just survive, but they thrive, right? And they lead. To Dimitri's point 8 questions ago, that they imagine a future that's on their own terms, right? It's not about what we lost, it's about what we want to build. And so I think our grief has to instruct us and sustain us, and not forget how we got here so it doesn't happen again.
So I don't want to respond to the question per se, but I did write a little something that I thought was important it's relatively short. Do you mind?
Of course.
Great.
Not.
All right. So I thought this was important. So I think I'm the only trans person on the panel. Some of you change your mind like you change your drawers. And that's okay, because that's the world that we live in, and you're welcome to do that. But with that being said, as the only trans person, I think it's imperative that I also say something about trans people and the attacks on trans people and how folks who aren't trans can fight back. So the attacks on trans women, it's not about trans people. And I have to remind you all about that. It is not about trans people. It's also not about bathrooms. It's also not about public safety. Are you all aware? And this is statistical. Dr. D. Mandis is a lawyer. She'll sue me if I'm wrong. The exact same number of hammerhead sharks that have walked on the moon is the same as the number of documented cases of trans women sexually assaulting cisgender women in public bathrooms. It's the exact same number. I want you all to think about that. The same number of hammerhead sharks that have walked on the moon. All right. So the opposition doesn't talk about trans men. If they were talking about, if they really were against trans people, they would talk about the entirety of our community. They would talk about trans men. They would talk about more than pronouns. All right. They don't talk about trans men, in part because what they're saying is me at 5'11" and 55 years old, that I'm too strong, too fast, too smart, I guess, to play 35 years ago on a football field, on a basketball team with their daughters. What they're not saying, because the reverse of that is, if that's the case, then that means trans men should do it. Guys that look like Robert, who were assigned female at birth, should be able to play with their daughters. They're not doing that. That's not the messages that they're doing, but it's the same thing. All right. Because the argument is that trans women are too strong, and that's not it. So that's not what they create laws to stop. This is all about controlling women in all of our glorious diversity. It doesn't minimize that men are suffering as well, but this is all about controlling women. And as a reminder, cis and trans simply describe a person's journey to personhood. Right, Doc? That's it. It just describes a person. So it's a descriptor and it's not a way of life. It's also not being weaponized against trans women. So that's why they picked abortion as their first fight. Because abortion is for people who have babies, who can carry babies. And they say only women can do that. So that's one of the reasons why that's proving my argument. So removing funding for people who need mental health services at an agency simply because they happen to have some clients that might be trans who are in a whole different department, that's not about trans people. That's about control. Banning words in 2025 is about control. It's not about trans people. Because what is one of the words that they've banned? Women. When you write grants and use the word women or woman, it gets dinged as being a DEI. All right. So we have to remember that. And for people who are not trans, it is imperative. Each and every time you hear misinformation and disinformation, every single time I got so excited I was pressing my mute button. Every single time that you challenge it and correct it, every time, no matter where you are, it's exhausting. It's exhausting. It's also necessary because trans people, we have to do it all the time. Your turn. And one last thing. I apologize, Bashar, but I had coffee literally as we were starting this conversation. Whew. All right. We all understand that this is about control. We also have to remember there is power when more power when we work together than when we work separately. Whoever it is that you are and whoever you represent, when you unite with someone probably that's not like you, you become an even stronger force for righting wrongs. And I think that's going to be how we're going to get through this thing. We're going to have to partner with folks who we may have never had a cup of coffee with, never shared a meal with, never been on a trip with. And we're going to have to pool our resources in ways that we haven't in the last 25 years.
Thank you so much for that, Tori. We're going to open it up to, we just have one audience question that's going to be lifted up on our screen. It's going to go to Carl Baloney. For someone who's feeling overwhelmed, what is one concrete action we can take this week to push back against these proposed cuts?
Okay, so for these proposed cuts are coming from the federal government. AIDS United is constantly working to provide space and lift voices of impacted populations, be that through our Public Policy Council or for individuals through AIDS Watch. It is our annual conference for people living with HIV and at risk for HIV and those who love them allies to come to DC and shape their personal stories and experiences into action for policy change. So from March 16th to the 17th, we'll be bringing hundreds of advocates from all over the country to speak truth to power in the halls of Congress. We really have to make sure that we hold these folks accountable. It looks like we're going to have midterms elections. I've been very nervous about that. So we better, show up and let them know that we're watching and paying attention. AIDS Watch is a great opportunity to do that.
Thanks, Carl. And thank you so much to our viewer, Christina, for lifting up that question. I want to sort of open it up to the other panelists, if you have any sort of closing thoughts before I sort of pass the baton off to the organizers of tonight's event.
I've really been moved as far as this last question, and thinking of the lessons that many of us have learned, over the last 40 plus years. No amount of respectability is going to save us. No amount of thinking that by distancing myself from people who are to something or to this or to that, that is going to prove my humanity. Like I think of, I'm the L in the LGBTQ movement, and to think of the ways that a movement that was started by Black and brown trans women, within 10, 15 years were isolated from their movement. That was a respectability conversation, right? That was I'm trying to be like you and they are too not like you. So I need to distance myself. We see this all the time in the HIV policy world, where like privately folks would be like, oh, well, we support CHOP's bold stances to end the criminalizing of HIV, but publicly, it's too risky because some way, shape, and form, I'm invested in this kind of stigma that literally makes a dichotomy of HIV, right? Of some people deserve to be criminalized and some don't. That's a form of respectability. That's a form of palatability. And I think it's clear that none of that will save us. Only being authentic and centering our fullness is what gets us through this moment. So like that is the lesson that has been clear. Like one can look at non-discrimination ordinances and how people, intentionally took the T out thinking it would make it easier to pass, promising to come back, and they never came back for trans folks. And half the time the shit didn't even pass the first time. Might as well have just kept it in there if you're going to do all that. Another conversation. But like really examining all the ways that we think being palatable gets us through, when in actuality it moves us further away from our communities.
I just have a very simple thing. And I feel like the last word that Mandisa said was community. And I feel like this is the time to actually rely on your community. And so I feel like, in different phases of my own experience, like I didn't really understand community. And I think now I understand community. Like I'm, you know, uh, I'm into my 50s, and the whole time I was pretty clear that I understood what it meant to be a part of community, whether it's being, an immigrant community, being in a gay community, being in I thought I understood. Now I understand. And and reflecting back to our for our people that founded the work that we do, thinking about what it was like when they were under attack in the 80s and 90s, and sort of looking at their camaraderie that they had, which I was always going like, wow, like, they've been through something, and it's not trauma bonding. It is also like sort of this like uplifting thing that I think that, our moment is that the way to make this work, the way to sustain ourselves, is to really understand community, and realize that community isn't just the thing that you lift up. It is also the thing that lifts you up. And so that, I think, for me, is my big takeaway from what's going on now, which is, I understand community now.
So I just want to thank all of our panelists for joining us tonight. And I want to thank Prolific Circle and GLAAD for inviting me to participate as a moderator as well. And I'm going to pass it back to our organizer, Jonathan, who will also be joined by a representative from GLAAD.
Well, thank you to all our panelists for this wonderful conversation. I was back here just smiling and tearing-eyed at the same time. I'm so empowered by your stories and your courage, your leadership. This has been a very much needed conversation, and I'm so thankful that you guys took the time to actually share yourself with all of us. I know Deshaun is here, and I would love for him to come up as well and say a few words.
Hey, thank you for welcoming me to the stage. Good evening, everyone. I'm Deshaun Usher, Vice President, Community and Media at GLAAD, and I'm also the founder and executive director of Moby. Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. First, I want to extend a great gratitude to you, Jonathan, for your amazing brainchild, and also want to extend that continuation of brilliance to the brilliant panelists. So thank you all, and to our moderator. Thank you for your honesty, your expertise, and for grounding this Road Days Day conversation in those lived experiences of Black and marginalized communities. We come together under the theme of centering Black and marginalized voices in the fight to end HIV, and tonight you reminded us that. You named how racism, transphobia, homophobia, criminalization, and poverty continue to shape how and who is most impacted by HIV. You also reminded us that our communities are not vulnerable, we are powerful, organized, and leading the way towards liberation, health, and justice. I also want to thank our community champions, Gilead Sciences, and all of our partners that were involved in making this possible. GLAAD, For West, the Prolific Circle, the Plaza Hotel, Moby, and Planned Parenthood of Greater New York for helping make this conversation possible. Collaboration like this is how we move forward from awareness to action. And as we close, I want to invite everyone watching to treat tonight as a starting point, not a finish line. So take what you've heard and turn that into something concrete. Have conversations with your family, your friends, your faith communities about HIV, stigma, and care. Get tested, know your status, and talk to your providers about PrEP, PEP, and treatment. Also, support the organizations represented here. Follow them, share their work, donate if you can. Giving Tuesday was yesterday, but it's never too late to give. Show up when you can, volunteer. Lastly, use your platforms, no matter how large or small, to uplift the stories of people living with HIV, especially Black, trans, queer, Latina, and formerly incarcerated people whose voices are often too erased. World AIDS Day is not just one date on the calendar, but our responsibility to one another is year round. So ending the HIV epidemic requires science and policy, and yes, but it also requires love, accountability, and a refusal to leave anyone behind. So, on behalf of everyone behind the scenes who worked on bringing this program to life, thank you for choosing to spend your evening in community with us. Stay connected, stay engaged, keep telling the truth about our stories, our power, and our right to live long, healthy, joyful lives. Good night, and let's keep doing the work together. Over to you, Jonathan.
Well, also, I want to say thank you to Deontis from AIDS United for all his work behind the scenes in helping making this possible. And we also want to say thank you to Dr. Malbranche David, who couldn't make it with us tonight, but he's in our hearts and our spirit. And we want to say that we miss him as well. And to you viewers, we want to thank you for your time. To everyone who made this possible, to our sponsors, our partners, and to everybody who believe in this vision, in our mission, thank you for supporting us. And with that, I want to say good night and see you later.